Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's good to see you all. Hi. So many familiar faces. Hi. So we're going to get started shortly. If we can just settle into our seats, get comfy, maybe take a couple of breaths before we start. Some people are still coming in, so just give them a couple more minutes. So welcoming every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Are you all ready for our guest speaker, Dr. Amy Saltzman? Yes? We've all been looking forward. Hi. So just so that you know, this time the entire session is going to be recorded. And so if you ask questions, that will be recorded too and streamed. I know our sessions are often not streamed for the questions and answers, but this time the entire session will be recorded. We do prefer that if you have questions, you ask the questions in the participants window, just so that Dr. Amy can have an interaction with you and see you. It's kind of like how we do our classes too. So that will be pretty much the same setup that we're used to. Yeah, what else? Let me see. The chat will be off for most of the time, so the interaction will be mainly through the participant window, as I was saying. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Amy Saltzman. So Dr. Amy is recognized as a pioneer in sharing mindfulness and self-compassion with children, adolescents, parents, teachers, counselors, athletes, coaches, business employees, and executives. She is a holistic physician and mindfulness coach, a wife, mother, devoted student of transformation, longtime athlete, and occasional a poet. Her passion is supporting people of all ages in enhancing their well-being and discovering the still quiet place within. She is recognized by her peers as a visionary and pioneer in the fields of mindfulness for youth and holistic medicine. Dr. Amy is also wrote 3 books. It's also written 3 books: A Still Quiet Place for Athletes, Mindfulness Skills for Achieving Peak Performance and Finding Flow in Sports and Life, A Still Quiet Place for Teens, a mindfulness workshop for ease, stress, and difficult emotions, A Still Quiet Place, a mindfulness program for teaching children and adolescents to ease stress and difficult emotions. I believe this is work that can benefit all of us and all the children within ourselves. So without further ado, here is Dr. Amy Saltzman.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And I'm gonna take a moment and share my screen and we'll continue. Okay, one sec. Just kidding. There we go. Okay. Let me just move things around. Okay, my friends. So the first thing is that I definitely prefer, if people are willing, real-time interaction. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature, and then Alex or the moderator will call on you and you can toggle on your video and your mic and we can actually have some interchange. So we're gonna start with another practice. So simply sitting If you're willing, closing your eyes. And if not, looking at a neutral spot in front of you. Bringing your attention to the breath. And feeling the belly expand with the in-breath and release with the out-breath. And see if you can rest your entire attention on the breath. Letting go of whatever it took to arrive here and whatever will come after, and choosing to rest the attention on the breath and the sensations of the breath in the belly. And see if you can feel the entire in-breath from the very first sip and expansion all the way through to where the breath is still. And then feel the entire out-breath from the very first whisper and release all the way through to where the breath is still again. And now see if you can let your attention rest in the still, quiet place between the in-breath and the out-breath. And the other still, quiet place between the out-breath and the in-breath. Settling into this stillness and quietness that's always alive inside of you. And perhaps you can notice that this stillness and quietness is always with you when you're breathing in, when the breath is still, when you're breathing out, when the breath is still, when you're talking or arguing or emailing or eating or dancing or laughing or feeling sad or afraid or angry. This stillness and quietness is always alive inside of you, and you can return to it just by attending to the breath. So I'm going to give you just a few moments to sit and feel the breath and the stillness and quietness underneath the breath, and then I'll bring you out and we'll continue. So in your own time, when you're ready, taking 3 slow, deep breaths. And opening your eyes and expanding your attention to include the group. So this is your first opportunity to raise your hand and participate. And I would love it if people would just say how that practice was for them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So if you have a comment, raise your hand and I'll respond.
We have a question from Gretchen. I'll ask her to unmute, and if you could please your video as well.
So can you see me?
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, okay. It wasn't a question, it was just you would ask for comments on how it made me feel. It took me back to my childhood when there was a large swing in my grandmother's backyard that sat up on a hill. And it was really long, old-fashioned, long roped swing, and on a very high hill. So you would get on this big swing. Usually there was enough room for two of us. And you'd pedal back and then let go. And when you got out over the hill, you know, up high, there's this moment where the swing stops before it goes back. And that's exactly the image that just floated right up in the middle of it, which was really nice.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Yeah.
Any other comments? And especially, I know most of you in this group have your own practice, but especially any difficulties or questions. And if not, we'll continue. So there will be more opportunity for participation. Okay.
We have a comment from Javon, and I'll ask her to unmute here.
Go ahead.
Hi, I just have a question. In general, when after the out breath, I have a very long gap before the in breath. So, I mean, the way that guided meditation seemed to be that it's almost like it's just a very small gap, whereas mine can be half the length of the out and the in breath, the actual stop. Is that normal?
Yes.
Or?
I think that's just your rhythm, right? Your rhythm is what it is, and there's no need to change the breath or make it different. You just notice the breath the way it is.
But in terms of, you know, focusing on the breath when there is no breath, what do I do?
Well, in that moment, the invitation is actually to focus on the stillness and the quietness.
Yes.
And part of the intention of where the phrase still quiet place came from is really that you know, these practices that we're going to do today, most of them are workable from 3 to 93. And so when you're teaching to a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old, like it's not really possible to say rest in awareness, right? Like that phrasing doesn't make any sense to them. And I think even for a lot of adults, it doesn't make that much sense. And so for them to notice that there is a place of stillness and quietness between the breaths, and that actually that stillness and quietness is always there, then you can start to talk about resting in your still quiet place and observing your thoughts, observing your feelings, observing your body sensations, observing what's going on in the external environment, and then being able to respond. So, yeah, when there's no breath, you can rest in stillness and quietness. Thank you.
The temptation then is to go off, though, when there's nothing to focus on.
I totally understand what you're saying. I totally get that, because it's not as active. And at the same time, it's not that there's nothing to focus on. Mm-hmm. We're actually resting in the stillness and quietness. And it's not as commanding or as engaging as the in-breath or the out-breath, but it's still there. It's just more subtle.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So I know you've all probably heard ad nauseum John's definition of mindfulness. And especially when I'm working with youth, I wanted to share my definition, which is mindfulness is paying attention here and now. So doing our best to be in the present moment and not the past or the future, with kindness and curiosity. So that's a child-friendly way of saying not judgmentally, but I actually kind of like it because it's a little more positive and it minimizes our human tendencies to look for mistakes or beat ourselves up. And we pay attention here and now with kindness and curiosity, ultimately so that we can choose our behavior. So that's this idea of responding rather than reacting. So that's the definition that I use, and we'll play with that a little bit. So we're actually going to do another practice, and then have some additional discussion. So if you're willing, sitting again and closing your eyes, bringing your attention to the breath. And when you're ready, just shifting your attention to how you're feeling right now. And some feelings have ordinary names, like curious, or sad, or angry, or happy. And other feelings may have more unusual names, like stormy, bubbly, fiery, or empty. So just allowing your feeling or feelings to tell you its name. And if it doesn't offer a name, you can just notice how the feeling feels in your body, which we'll get to in a minute. And now checking in with, how does this feeling actually feel in my body? First of all, where is it? Is it a tightness in my temples, a smile on my face, a warmth in my chest, a clenching in my belly? Just noticing where the feeling shows up in the body. And then noticing how the feeling shows up in the body. So is it big or small? Is it cool or warm? Is it light or heavy? Is it smooth or jagged? Is it still or moving? And then noticing or imagining if the feeling has a color or colors. And if it doesn't, that's fine. And then listening or imagining if the feeling has a sound. And again, if it doesn't, that's fine. And often it's enough to simply give our feelings our kind and curious attention in this way. And sometimes it can be helpful to ask our feelings what they want from us. And usually feelings want something simple like time, kindness, attention, a way to express themselves. So perhaps you can ask your feeling what it wants from you. And rarely a feeling will ask for something from us that we're not able to give. And if that's the case, we can talk about that afterwards. And when you're ready, thanking your feeling and returning your attention to the breath. And taking 3 slow, deep breaths in your own time. And opening your eyes and expanding your attention to include the group. And again, I'll take questions, reflections, curiosities, complaints. What did people notice? What was your experience? I see Sinead saying.
Yeah, we got Sinead. I'm going to ask her to unmute here.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Sinead. How are you?
Great to have you here. What I noticed was when you asked the question, what it asks of us. And it's whenever you say it afterwards, usually it's just something simple, such as time, etc. And yeah, that really made an impact on me when you said, you know, it's usually something simple, because I was sitting with an anxiety. That was my feeling in my stomach about something, and I realized it was because of actually lack of time, that the feeling had really built because I haven't had time to do everything that I needed to do, and it's still sitting here. But it was like, you know, it was very gentle in that it's you know, how can I nourish my feeling, and just that simple thing reminded me that it's time, and how precious time is to give to that will actually help me move forward in the rest of my evening. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Good to see you. Ginny, go ahead.
Oh, hello. Now I'm unmuted. I was delighted with your suggestions for the meditation, as I had actually come just minutes before from having been in a wonderful acupuncture session in which I had had an opportunity to find my heart. Took a while to get there, as it always does for me, but I had been there, and then that session came to a natural close, and I was coming home driving and thinking how lucky I am that I'm going to be going to another meditation. And you picked me right up where I was and where I wanted to go back to. It still took me a while, as it always does, to get to my heart. But this time, my heart was really quite ready to speak to me. Once I got there, it had a lot to say to me, and I'm going to go back and listen some more, because it was you helped me find where I had felt, and I thought, well, this is going to be another track, and I'll do whatever Amy Saltzman says to do. But you had me do what my heart wanted to do, which was to explore different kinds of feelings. You suggested kindness, etc., and it went there, but it really said, just pay attention and I'll tell you what I want. You don't need to tell me my sound or my color. I thought of those, but those were thoughts, not what my heart was feeling. And I just had a delightful time with my sort of new friend, my heart, because my heart has been hard for me to find. I tend to greet the world through words and thinking. So thank you very much. I'm going to continue this practice.
Thanks, Ginny. And I'm pretty sure that this practice is on the Insight Timer. If you look under my name, there's a version of it there. It might be, the vocabulary might be slightly more geared towards young children, but if you want to hear it again, first of all, I know that Alex is recording, but second of all, that's another place to find it.
Thank you.
And I have an invitation for you, which is, perhaps you could drop the thought and the story that it always takes me a long time to connect with my heart and just let it take however long it takes each time. But like sometimes you may connect very quickly and other times not so much.
Okay, I want that one. I will accept that invitation. I would love it. Thank you.
Great. And I'm just going to pause here because I want to give ample opportunity for anybody who had difficulty or struggled or just has questions about that practice before we move to the next. It's going to expand on this topic, but just especially if you were struggling, because you probably weren't the only one, I'm happy to hear from you.
There's also a comment by Susan saying that was the first time I communicated with my heart feelings in the way, and I found in the way, and I found it incredibly enlightening, helpful, and moving. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. Okay. So the intention of that practice is to support people of all ages in having your feelings, actually knowing what you're feeling when you're feeling it, without your feelings having you. So the idea is that we're inviting ourselves to be aware of and befriend our feelings so that they're not burbling up and leaking out and coming out in harsh words or poor choices. And often in adult practice, we're kind of taught or invited to sit in awareness and notice our thoughts and our feelings and our physical sensations, but we're not always taught kind of the intricacies of really, how do I discover what I'm feeling? How do I notice what I'm feeling in my body? And how do I honor, befriend, and take care of that feeling? So this is the idea. Part of what happens for me when I started teaching to youth is I wanted to pull out the various components of standard adult sitting practice and make them individual components. So observing thoughts is one component, befriending feelings is another component, being aware of our physical sensations is another component, and then how do all of those things interact? Like, how do my thoughts influence my feelings? How do my feelings show up in my body? The idea is kind of breaking it down and then helping the kids or the adults, because now when I teach to adults, my teaching to adults is informed by how I teach to kids. And so I teach to adults much the same way now as I teach to kids. Because as Alex said, we all have that inner child that probably could use some more attention. So I'll pause there just to see if there's any questions or comments, and then we'll go on to kind of expanding on the feelings practice. Richard, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi. Further to what Ginny was saying about it taking time for her, I'm having some difficulty, or I did have difficulty with the last practice because, I've been reflecting on it, and I tend to take more time to examine my feelings. They tend to take longer to bubble up to the surface in some kind of clarity. I also prefer, generally speaking, less guided meditations than more fully guided meditations. And realizing that these meditations are geared towards the younger age of the spectrum, where I'm at the other end of the spectrum, I'm finding it going by too quickly. And I'm also finding a little frustration in that as I'm just accessing it, you're asking me to move on to something else. So it's not a serious complaint, it's just a series of observations as to how it's affecting me. And the only reason I bring it up is because I figure this is only happening to me, and every time I think that, I'm completely wrong. So I just thought I would mention that. Thank you.
So I'm quite certain it's not only happening to you. And you could definitely stretch this out, the whole process out to half an hour. And I encourage, if you have the time and space to do that, I encourage people to do that. At the same time, part of the intention is we don't always have half an hour. And then often what happens is we stuff it and we forget about it. And then it does come out in words or behavior that we regret. And so there is some value in at least being able to do a quick check-in with yourself and be like, yep, I'm starting to get agitated here. Yep, I definitely prefer it to be slower and more spacious. Like, just even acknowledging that has value. And, there's certainly circumstances in our lives where, as much as we'd love to take the half an hour, it's not going to happen. So I think there is value in both. It's not an either or. And I think in some ways, maybe as we talk about this next part, the intention will become clearer. So some of you may have heard of Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman is a research scientist who has looked at emotional expression all across the world. And he has, in highly developed countries and countries with no TV, no internet, no radio, like just au natural countries, he's found that there are at least 7 universal emotions. And each universal emotion has its own kind of facial signature and body signature. And in general, in the wild, it has a natural time course. And he depicts the time course like this. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But, the emotion comes, it has a wave, and then it subsides. And at the top of the emotion is something called the refractory period. And when we're in the refractory period, we are in our lizard brain, and we are in fight, flight, or freeze. And we can't be creative, compassionate, take someone else's perspective, problem solve. We're just in survival mode. So a couple notes. one of the benefits of really taking the time, like Richard was saying, to really meet and befriend our feelings is we can start to learn and to see sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes that very little beginning curve, that place where my tone of voice is getting irritated, or I'm starting to grind my teeth, or my shoulders are up by my ears, or my fists are clenched. And I can be like, something's up, and I am going to take a pause, even if it's just a few breaths of a pause, or a 5-minute pause, or if I'm blessed to have it, the half an hour pause, to check in with myself before I respond to whatever the circumstance is. So sometimes we can notice the beginning of the feeling on the beginning of the curve and just kind of take care of ourselves and not have to go through the full wave. The other thing is when we are in the wave, usually the best we can do is something my son called shut up and sit there when he was in a difficult carpool. Like, usually it's best to just let the wave pass before we interact with anyone. So if we're having a big wave, we can let the wave pass. And then the other thing is, if someone else that we're interacting with is having a big wave, it doesn't matter how brilliant, kind, compassionate, helpful you intend to be, they can't really hear you. And so it's often helpful to let their wave pass as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how this plays out in real life. So the first thing I wanted to say is, as I mentioned, so that was kind of Paul Ekman. And now this is Amy's riff on Paul Ekman. The first thing I want to say is that in general, not all our emotional curves as human beings look like that lovely bell curve that I just showed you. And often they look much more like this. So just being honest and realistic about what it means to be human, this is what our curves sometimes look like. The second thing I wanted to say is that as human beings, we can often have more than one emotion at the same time. So I can be angry and afraid, or I can feel excited and nervous, or I can feel both happy and sad. So within me, I can have more than one emotion. And then if you're interacting with another person, or a family group, or a work team, or an athletic team, then you have multiple people who can potentially have multiple waves. And one of the realities of this is, if I'm having a big wave and Sinead is having a big wave and our waves are in sync, you're going to get an even bigger wave. There's this concept in physics that I'm borrowing called constructive interference, which means if I have a big wave and someone else has a big wave at the same time, we're going to get an even bigger wave. Now, there's also something called destructive interference. I don't have such a nice graphic for that one yet. But if I'm having a big wave and Alex is having a trough, or Alex can kind of maintain her cool, then we'll get, I don't think in human interaction we ever get this flat line, but you'll get slighter ripples. Okay. And then just to complete the perspective, if there are multiple people and everyone's having a big wave at the same time, then often you can get what I call an emotional tsunami. And again, if one person can maintain their calm, or even if they, like, you can have a sense of humor about it and say, like, in your family on a long car ride, or, you know, when something's not right at the airport, if we ever get to go to the airports again, you can say, like, we're having an emotional tsunami. Let's take a step back. Let's reset. So I'm going to pause again here and see if there are comments or questions or reflections before we go on. Okay. So for me, being aware of that beginning of the emotion lets me stop and take a breath and choose my behavior. So we're tying the practices together. Okay. Some of you may know this poem, and I will actually invite you to close your eyes and I will read it to you, and then we can talk about it as well. So it's called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am hopeless. It isn't my fault, and it takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault, and it still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is still there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It's my fault, and I get out immediately. Chapter 4, and I have to say, when I read this to like kids who are 10, 11, 12, somebody at this point just goes like, oh, really? Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5, I walk down another street. So when I'm teaching, I use this analogy for the distinction between responding and reaction. So if I'm working with a family, if I'm working with an athletic team or a business team, I'll say, like, what are your common holes? And I'll use a family example. So it might be either kids arguing with each other or kids and parents arguing. Often it's arguing about something like screen use or something. And so that's the whole, is the argument. And then we can, in the office, talk about, okay, what are some different streets? What are some potential solutions? If you can't find a different street, could you maybe at least just sit down on the sidewalk and not have the same argument over and over again? So this is just a very concrete way to introduce this idea of responding rather than reacting. And the other thing I like to share is that often the different street is much farther back, like the exit or whatever is much farther back than we think it. So for example, if you have trouble getting out of the house in the morning, or your family has trouble getting out of the house in the morning, the different street may not be in the morning. It may have to do with preparation in the evening. But if you ask individuals and groups what their common holes are, they'll usually be able to tell you. So I'll pause here again for questions or reflections. And I'll actually, while we're paused, I'll invite you to think of a particularly common hole that you have in your life. So usually these holes are like repetitive difficulties. And maybe you can think of some different streets and share them with us, either on the screen or in the chat. Or if you're someone who has a hole and you're not seeing the different streets, I'd be happy to talk about that with you. Dante, go ahead.
Hi there.
Hi.
So you triggered, I posted, my version of Wise Ass in the chat because.
Fortunately for me, I can't see the chat. So will you tell me your wise ass comment?
Yeah. you triggered something earlier where you said, share whatever's you share something, complaint, you know, and you used the word complaint, one of the things you suggested. And then that triggered in me. I'm, formerly a New Yorker, so we're master complainers. We're the kvetches and the oyas of the universe. Greatest wine country of them all. Napa or Sonoma, they pale in comparison. And then what it triggered in me was, my complaint was I had no complaints. That was my complaint. But what you're asking right now, one of the things that occurs for me more frequently than I still is my reactive tendencies, which actually I see as a strategy that I learned as a New Yorker. And it's a way that I react that basically overwhelms someone. So I had an episode just the other day in response to an Amazon purchase, and I reached them by phone, and I'm speaking to some woman who's in the Philippines, which that triggered me. And I just really went off on this woman. And I see that just keep on repeating itself, but I also see that it's kind of a strategy. And it's a strategy that's multifaceted. If that, and I learned it in New York, but it's just such a programmed piece within me that I've yet to be able to pause it and roll it back prior to it actually emerging.
So if you first of all, thank you for sharing. And second of all, if you look at like the very beginning seeds of that conversation with that Amazon support person. So it's way, way, way before you get on the phone, right? It's like when the package arrived and the thing wasn't right or whatever it was. And in that moment is where we start down the street and we start telling a particular story, and we tend to like be collecting evidence and et cetera, et cetera. But where along that process between when, again, I'm not sure the exact details, but the thing, you open the box and it's not what you ordered, and the conversation with the person on the phone where you were perhaps, didn't conduct yourself in the way that you feel most effective or kind or useful, where can you see a different street anywhere between those two places?
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't kind, and yet I was effective. Okay, so it turned out that I placed an order, and then I saw later on in the day, like 10 hours later, that the item that I placed, that I purchased, was priced less, and so I tried to actually cancel that item and then just repurchase it, and they wouldn't allow that. And then when I called them, I just basically, just said, well, just give me a credit right there. You could see it's in my cart, and that's the price that I bought it at, and this is the price right now in this moment. And the woman said, I can't do that. And so I just basically just went into this whole thing, and where I just said, look, you either return that money, or let me tell you that I will return the entire order, and Amazon will be out. So it was like, and so I got an email. So this was 2 days ago. So I got an email yesterday from this woman that said she had seen that the order was shipped, and that she refunded the money, and I'll see it on my Visa. And so, like I said, I was not kind, totally see that, yet I was effective. And like I said, it is a strategy. It's a learned strategy. Trump does it all the time. I am not Donald Trump, but this is what he does.
So let me pause you for a minute right there, and just just for fun.
Okay.
Like as an experiment.
Yes.
Perhaps consider
that
the next time one of these, you know all of this about yourself. You're very self-aware. So perhaps consider, like with something small, that the next time your intention is going to be kindness. Because I think underneath this whole thing, there's a story that it's a choice between kindness and effectiveness. And at least you could try like kindness first.
Okay. Do you want to hear crazy? Because the story.
So we're not gonna, just because there's other people, and I'm happy to like stay on after and have this chat with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because there's other people and there's other things. But it's like, if you always take like I'm looking at the street sign now, if you always take the effectiveness street and you get where you want to go using the effectiveness street, then it's like, oh, well, the way to get from no result to a result is to go down effectiveness street. But really, there are lots of other potential routes that you could play with. So just try taking a different street and see what happens. And if you get lost and you want to go back to effectiveness street, because that's how you know you're going to get where you want to go, you can do it. But at least try another street first. Marianne, go ahead.
Unmute. Okay, great. So I have mastered walking down another street. I have totally mastered that, but how is that not just avoiding sometimes? Because sometimes it's easier to detour and take another street than it is to actually deal with, especially if it's relationship where the waves keep you both end up, so you can have conflict resolution with a family member, for instance, and it might be that you both end up hitting that wave high at the same time. So I recognize it and I can see that there are triggers, but how do you still
so let me without
having to go another street.
so I don't know how many of you know the Aikido exercise from MBSR, but basically it's an exercise and there's generally a visual. So if someone's walking at me with an angry face and their arms outstretched, I have a bunch of options, right? I can cower and say, please, please, I don't want to fight, I can sidestep them, right? Like that passive aggressive thing. I can push back, be super, super angry. Or the Aikido piece is like kind of, I let them come at me with their arms outstretched, and I grab their arms and I turn them so that I see their perspective and they see my perspective. And one of the interesting things is when this is taught in MBSR, usually the implication is that last one, the assertive response, where I'm looking at their point of view and they're looking at my point of view, is the best response. But the truth is that in any given moment in our lives, the most skillful response may be submissive or aggressive or passive aggressive or assertive, and you need to choose. And just like the person who spoke before, we all have our default. So some of us, if someone comes at us like energetically, I'm not saying necessarily physically, our first response is to fight back, or our default response is to submit or to sidestep, or to always try and see the other person's point of view. And the question is, in each moment, what's called for? And often if we have a default, then we have to really, really consider those other streets. So if I'm always, it sounds to me like you're more like either submissive or passive aggressive, like sidestepping. then your different street might be the assertive street of saying, no, that really isn't true for me, or that really doesn't feel good to me, or that's not okay with me. And it takes, if you've been using, again, just like the person before, if you've, let's use that example, right? Like his tendency is kind of the aggressive street. And so he might want to try something else. But if your tendency is the sidestepping street, then you might want to try being more assertive. It's like, it's trying something new. Go ahead. Marianne, were you going to say something else?
Yes, I was just going to say, so if you've tried, as a parent, if you've tried the assertive approach, because when your kids are little, I think it's the challenge of, as you said, knowing when to use what. And
yep.
When the kids are little, you tend to use the assertive one because kids are really malleable and it's quick to get them into the car, whatever. As they get older, you're respecting more the fact that they vocalize their opinions more. So I guess it's trying to shift and know what is the best route to take all the time. But sometimes you get into that pattern where the waves. So the assertiveness approach worked for a while, but I tend to, keep hitting waves on the other side. And all you're trying to do is be helpful. And sometimes if you're being if you're being passive or always taking another street, it's actually not solving anything. It's just delaying things in the long run. So it's a dilemma in a particularly in a familial example. It's hard and everybody's stressed right now during the pandemic. Everyone has their stress, whether it's, watching young people without work and they're frustrated. So you don't want to add to their tsunami.
Right. So I'm hoping that we'll come back to some of that in a minute. So I'm going to offer 3 kind of intertwined practices, but we're going to do the longest, most detailed practice first. So sitting, letting all the conversation that we've had up till this point recede into the background. Resting your attention on the breath. And this peace practice is a practice that can be used in any difficult situation. So I invite you to bring a difficulty to mind, and it might be a big difficulty or a small difficulty. You can choose what you want to take on. And so when we notice things are difficult, we can practice peace. And the P in peace stands for pause. So when we notice things are difficult, often it's best to first pause. And the E, the first E, stands for exhale. So just exhaling. And then inhaling. Just keep breathing. And I have to smile and think about my friend who likes less guided practices. So you get to be with your frustration if it's here in this moment. And the A stands for acknowledge, accept, and allow. So we can acknowledge that the situation is as it is. The family situation is tense. Amy's guiding practices with more words than I prefer. The child is out of work or the adult is out of work. And acknowledging doesn't mean that you like it. It just means that you acknowledge that it is the way it is. And then you can stretch to accept the situation and your reaction to it. So maybe you're angry or sad or jealous or frustrated or all of the above. And so just accepting the situation and your initial reaction and allowing yourself and the situation to be as it is. And then the C is for choose. And choosing often involves some other C's. So clarity, being clear about what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. Courage, so courage to speak your truth. And Marianne, this gets back to what you said, and to hear the truth of others. And compassion, so compassion for how difficult it can be to be a human being, ordinarily, never mind during the time of COVID. And the last C stands for comedy. And perhaps a better word would be humor, but humor doesn't start with C. So sometimes just having a sense of humor about the dilemma can be helpful. And then E is for engage. And depending on the intensity of the situation, you may be able to engage after a few minutes or a few hours. And sometimes it can be a few days or even a few weeks. But after you've paused and exhaled and accepted and allowed and chosen, you can re-engage with the situation. And sometimes the best way to engage is to choose not to engage. So I know that that was a fast practice with a lot of words, and it does give you a template to play with in your own time in difficult situations. So I'm going to let you rest your attention on the breath. And in your own time, taking 3 deep breaths. And opening your eyes and expanding your attention to include the group. And now I just want to give you 2 kind of shorter versions of that practice. So, if you're like Richard, you may want to take the peace practice and give yourself a full hour to play with a particular dilemma. But there's also moments in life where we need something short and sweet. So a shorter, sweeter version of this practice is just aware, breathe, choose. So when you're having a difficulty, simply becoming aware that things are difficult, taking some deep breaths, and then choosing your response can be this practice. And Marianne, I think this might be helpful for you, and we may expand on this in a minute, but I call it 3 breaths practice. So taking a breath for yourself, like, it's getting a little bumpy. What am I thinking? How am I feeling? What do I want, right? And so if we use situations with our children, usually I'm thinking they should be doing it differently. I'm feeling frustrated and I want them to listen to me, right? So that's me. But now I need to take a breath for my child. And what is she thinking? She's thinking, I'm 20 years old and I want my autonomy. She's feeling irritated and she wants me to back off. And then a breath for now, now that I've really, really stepped into her shoes, how do I want to interact with her? So I'll pause here for questions on those three kind of interrelated practices for responding in difficult moments. Okay. So I want to expand then on the listening piece for a minute. And again, you can either read this with me and we'll, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Marzehe, do you want to say your question and then we'll do the poem? Go ahead. And will you tell me how to say your name?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Marziye.
Thank you.
So I myself, okay, I can see now. And yeah, first of all, I would like to say thank you to you and then Alex and then technical support also. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful session. And my question is related to like previous practice and also this one together. And then maybe I talked before with Alex also. But my question is, okay, sometimes I feel like the waves, and then as you told, like I feel my shoulder, I hold it here, and then the difficult situation. So I try to breathe and then, or sometimes sit. But the things is, I feel sometimes I'm lost between thoughts. What about the other practice that you said, just recognize that it's the difficult situation? So when I do meditation and then when it's finished, I feel like, okay, I don't want to open my eyes. I prefer to sit and then be inside of myself instead of to open my eyes and start the life again. And then because, so when I found it like stormy, as John Kabat-Zinn always advises us to go deeper and deeper and deeper, there is like calm place to stay. So I feel, okay, I need to open my eyes and then start the life again. No, I don't want. And it seems scary, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly much easier to maintain most of the time. It's much easier to maintain that sense of calm when we're not interacting with anyone. And over time, with practice, we want to learn to, as much as possible, and none of us are going to do it all the time. We want to carry that sense of calm into our interactions. And it takes practice, and it takes making mistakes to be able to do that. And so part of it is then going back to the C's of compassion and comedy in the peace practice. Like, be compassionate with yourself when you can't carry the calm with you, and have a sense of humor about it. It's like, I lost it again. I said that thing I didn't want to say. And then it's like with meditation and the breath, then you start over and you try again. but be gentle.
Okay.
And, you know, if life's really intense, you may choose that you want to sit more and do more practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Okay. We can talk about listening, or I'm happy to take more questions. So if there's questions, because I know we're coming up on time, I'm happy to do that. And then if not, I'll go into this piece on listening. So I see some things happening in the chat, but with the screen share, I just see little notes. I don't see the whole thing. Okay, so I'll just read this and we can talk about this and then have time for a few questions. So you may want to read along, or you may prefer to just listen to the poem. Listen. So, when I ask you to listen to me and you start giving me advice, you have not done what I have asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you are trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. Listen. All I ask is that you listen. Don't talk or do, just hear me, and I can do for myself. I am not helpless. I may be discouraged and faltering, but not helpless. When you do something for me that I can and need to do for myself, you contribute to my fear and inadequacy. But when you accept as a simple fact that I feel what I feel, no matter how irrational, then I can stop trying to convince you and get about the business of understanding what's behind this irrational feeling. And when that's clear, the answers are obvious and I don't need advice. Irrational feelings make sense when we understand what's behind them. So please listen and just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn and I will listen to you. So I would say that this is an essential mindfulness skill. And this poem really describes the quality of mindful listening. And as I mentioned, kind of stepping out of our shoes and into the shoes of someone else. And especially in this crazy time of COVID and staying home and all the stresses and difficulties, it's really important that we listen to others with this open-hearted quality and that we listen to ourselves with this open-hearted quality. So I'll give a minute here for questions either about the poem or really about anything. And
Amy,
then we'll go for them.
Sorry, Sophie had a question in chat. I'm not sure, Sophie, if you want to come on video and maybe ask for that clarification. And if not, that's okay.
Can you just read it maybe if she doesn't want to come on?
Sure.
I'm here, actually.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you, Amy, very much. It's a super quick question. And it was, sorry, regarding the thing beforehand, I really liked the PEACE acronym. And I missed the last E. Maybe you could just say those acronym things again, because I wrote it down. I really liked it. And I also really liked, I can say this now since we're on the poem already, thank you very much for this poem. It sums up a lot of feelings or difficulties there are sometimes very well.
Great, thank you. So the simple letters of the acronym are pause, exhale, acknowledge, accept, and allow, choose, which contains clarity, courage, compassion, and comedy, and then engage. The last E is engage.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Macy.
Yes, it's so nice to see you again. Many years ago, I did a training with you and used it in my work with kids, and would love to hear how you've been either modified it or how it's maybe shifted in this time of being virtual during the pandemic. I'm just curious about how you, in your work with kids and families, how that either has remained the same or has changed a bit.
Yeah, well, I have an added wrinkle. So not only did COVID happen, but last September I moved from Northern California to Santa Barbara. So I had moved in September. I was getting ready to open my office actually March 15th to sign a lease, March 15th, which I didn't. So I'm grateful for that. And then COVID happened, and so I've been at home, but in a new community, and so I haven't really yet made connections with kids and schools and stuff. So right this minute, I'm teaching to anyone who wants to learn from me on Zoom, and that's primarily right now adults like you who want to teach mindfulness to youth. I am seeing individual patients and individual families on Zoom, and I'm doing some work with athletes and coaches on Zoom. I'm not yet, I just had a conversation with the local group who's teaching mindfulness in the schools here, which they're also doing on Zoom. Like earlier this week, I connected with them because they reached out to me for support. And so I'll probably get involved in that. Here, they are starting to gradually open up the classrooms, but a lot of the adults that I've worked with that are offering mindfulness to youth are just adapting to doing it on Zoom, and it's going reasonably well. I mean, the curriculum can still be delivered, and you have the plus of no one's elbowing their neighbor, and you have the minus of not the direct, really in-person interaction. And the other minus of just people are burnt out on Zoom. But overall, I mean, I think it's going as well as can be expected, and people are finding for sure that, the kids need it, the teachers need it, the parents need it. So that's helpful.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
We actually have a question, real quick. We have a question from Nate. He asked it. He didn't ask the question, but he just wanted to see if he had a minute to answer his question. So I'll ask him to unmute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I have a question that's actually similar to Macy's question, but a little bit different. I am a teacher. We have a mental health day, which is why I'm able to join you today.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you have any tips or resources or recommendations to find ways to layer mindfulness into a classroom context. I work with adolescents, mostly 14 and 15-year-olds. And so I've observed that shorter practices maybe work better. And I don't know if calling it mindfulness would turn them off. So just curious.
Can you tell me two more things, where you are geographically and the content that you're actually responsible for teaching?
Yes, I'm in Los Angeles. So mindfulness is kind of in the ether of what my students are aware of. I work at a day school, and I teach high school Spanish. Okay,
so yeah. I mean, there are definite advantages to being in California as opposed to like Texas or Alabama or something, because there are other issues there that we could talk about. And I still feel super strongly that when you're bringing mindfulness into public schools, that it needs to be done in a very secular way. so as to not come up on issues of separation of church and state. But in Spanish, right, like first of all, you could just teach the practice in Spanish and you'd be building, you know, vocabulary and understanding and giving them some space to do that. And in general, my practice, my rule of thumb for kids, and this gets a little bit different with teenagers, but it's like the most practice they can do is kind of however many minutes they are old. So if you're working with 15-year-olds, like 15 minutes would be the longest that I would do. But in general, I would start with shorter, more guided practices and then build up to longer, more spacious practices. But even you know, and then you can play with things like talking about feelings and words for feelings in, you know, in Spanish. So happiness, sadness, anger, and like what's the difference in Spanish between anger and frustration, and like there's a lot of ways to play with it. And if you're really, really interested, then there's a couple options. I have a CD for teens that's out, that's available on iTunes and Amazon, where you could hear all the guided practices. We've done some of them, but not all of them. And then I have the book that Alex mentioned at the beginning. And yeah, so on the bottom left is this book that really talks about the art of teaching mindfulness to youth. And then if you're really, really, really interested, then you could join the next online course for teaching mindfulness to youth. And, you know, I think it's when you're a teacher who is teaching other content, there are fun ways to play with it and just build in little tidbits, like either once a week or, you know, at the beginning of every class. Over time, if you do it through the whole fall where you're teaching, and then both their mindfulness fluency and their Spanish fluency increases, then you can ask them to lead a practice for you in Spanish. Like there's lots of fun ways to play with it, and I just encourage you to be patient and creative. You're muted, Nate.
Okay. Thank you. That's super
You're
helpful.
welcome.
I really appreciate
and
it.
And if you want to like reach out to me later and have a longer conversation, that's fine.
I might. Thank you so much.
Amy, I have a question about the poem, and people would like to know who's the author of the poem and where they can find it.
Right. So the first one about the holes and the different streets is Portia Nelson. And the second one about listening is Leo Buscaglia. And I guess also, Alex, I could probably just send it to you and you could put them up. I think I've edited the listen one slightly. I think I took out a reference to God in there. So I think it's slightly edited. Other questions or comments? Okay, then maybe if it's okay with you, Alex, we'll just close with a really brief sit and go from there. Last call for questions. Go ahead.
We have one. Yeah, Javon has one. 1 second.
Javon, were you going to say something?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
This time I'm going to breathe before I speak. Remember to be mindful. Just if anything specific in times of COVID, you know, I'm finding it particularly difficult in terms of I know I've overreacted because I tend to want to sanitize everything that comes in the door, and we're about to go to the top level here in Ireland, and but I was always at level 5, you know. I do go out and I do medical appointments and all that, and I'm still shaking even though I took the breath.
Yeah, I think you know, I think it's important all the time, but I think especially in the times of COVID, gentleness and humor, like, you know, when you know that you're like being a little bit crazy or overreactive or whatever, it's just like, yep, there I go again, you know, like, but I had this, I'm terrible at accents, but I had this man in one of my first adult MBSR classes, and he was in artificial intelligence at Stanford, and he was like super buttoned down British guy and very kind of serious, but also very stressed. And like in week 6 or week 7, he came in and he said, you know, now when and I can't even remember what it was that he did, I just say, silly old bear. And it's like just something to lighten things, to have a sense of humor, to give yourself some compassion. We didn't cover the slides on self-compassion, but just, you know, even a hand on your heart, like, honey, I know it's rough. You're doing the best you can. Like, you know, and for guys, that may not be like your favorite phrasing, but you can come up with your own of like, you know, just hang in there. This too will pass. It's going to be fine. But yeah, gentleness and humor for sure.
Thank you. And the slides on self-compassion, will we be able to see them? That sounds like a...
Well, Alex and I can talk about if we want to do another day or something. I just didn't have time for everything, but we could definitely come back to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And to Alex as well, and all the participants.
Yeah, so let's just take a couple minutes to sit together. So resting the attention on the breath. And perhaps taking a moment of gratitude for this time together, for this time to be with yourself, for the technology that lets us be both together and apart, and for the practice and the stillness and quietness that's always inside of us. So just resting with the breath. And when you're ready, taking 3 slow, deep breaths in your own time. And opening your eyes and setting the intention to take your kindness and curiosity into your next moments. And if anyone wants to reach me, you can reach me through my website, and I'll just give it back to Alex.